everyone. Thank you so much for taking some time with us today. We really appreciate that. And this, we hope today might be the first of an annual sort of debrief from the field season. This has been a year like no other, and we want to talk with you about that today. First of all, for any of you who might be a little bit new to Friends of Casco Bay, I think most of you in the attendee list know us pretty well, but our mission is to improve and protect the environmental health of Casco Bay here on the coast of Maine. And we do that by basing all of our work on good, solid science. We believe that clean marine water is fundamental habitat. And to that end, the science that we do isn't just for the sake of science. We do our science in order to move the needle on the health of the bay, as we say. And we don't do this work alone. We do it with many of you who are in the audience with us today, and many, many people in the community and indeed across the country. That said, I'm going to introduce to you now two of our most key staff members. Everyone is critical in our ensemble of people, but I want to invite Ivy Frignoca, our Casco Baykeeper, who is the eyes, ears, and voice of Casco Bay, and our chief lead public advocate on behalf of the Bay. She's one of 300 plus water keepers around the world who all work with independent organizations such as ours. And we couldn't do the policy and advocacy work that we do today without her incredible talents. And I think you'll get a sense of her personality today too, as well, if you don't know her. And then also on the screen is Mike Doan, who's our staff scientist. Mike has been on our staff for well over 2 decades. We have quite a longevity of getting good staff members and keeping them. We love that. And Mike is really the visionary behind much of the way that we are currently doing our science. And we're going to get into that a little bit today. But this is going to be a rather informal format today. We're going to have a conversation with you, and I'm going to interview Ivy and Mike a little bit, and there'll be some give and take. We hope that it won't be too clunky with this technology and the delays and things, so we'll try not to sound like we're interrupting each other, but we're really excited to share the conversation with all of you who are listening. And we'll try to break early enough so that there'll be time for a few questions and answers, which will come back on the screen later and help direct us to those questions. So I'm going to turn this over to you, Ivy and Mike. Maybe, Ivy, we might start with you. In all the rest of our lives, 2020 was unlike any year I think any of us have ever even imagined, let alone experienced. And yet our work went on, right? Our office shut down in early to mid-March, and we've continued our work. How we do it has fundamentally changed, but we've been doing our work. And I want to really hear from you and Mike today. What did you see out there this summer? Same old, same old? Was it different? What was different? What really comes to mind?
It was an interesting year, Kathy. And first off, we were so glad to be out there this year because that's the way we do our work. We have to be out, see the bay, collect the data, make decisions based on what we're seeing. And we also just need to fill our souls with spending time on the bay that we all love, like every member of this organization, every friend of Casco Bay loves. So just wanted to say that first, Kathy, because that's just so important to why we do this work and why we're out there. So Mike and I were able to get out on the bay and do water quality monitoring like we normally do. We weren't able to invite many of our friends out with us. We weren't able to use the boat as an office, but we still did our work. And he'll share with you some of the science. Some of the observations that really stuck out for me were that both the beginning and the end of the summer, the water was so clear. And there was a time when we were out in Broad Cove just a couple weeks ago where I put a Secchi disc down. And for those of you who were not part of our citizen stewards in the past or haven't done water quality monitoring, a Secchi disc is it's like a round circle, and it's got 2 black triangles and 2 white triangles, and it's on a long rope. You put it over the side of the boat, and it measures, it's marked off by meters, the rope. And we see how far down it goes in relation to the bottom of the water. And then that gives us some measurement of water clarity. And the last time we were out in Broad Cove, that I was able to put the Secchi disc down 5 meters. I mean, that's really far for the water to be that clear. And one of the, I don't know what that means in terms of water quality. We think it means that there was less phytoplankton. This is like a phenomena we saw this year. But one of the magical things it did was that visually we saw some things we didn't see before. And there was a site in particular, the Oars and Bailey Island Yacht Club, where we've been monitoring water quality for a couple decades or more, where every time we went there and it was mid to high tide, it was like watching a ballet. The water was so clear that as we were walking out onto the dock, I looked over the side and there was this most gorgeous rockweed just swaying in time with the motion of the water. So there were definitely some magical moments out there, but there was a lot that was different. Super high water temperatures, very, very clear, weird storm patterns, so that we had periods of intense drought with the highest salinity levels I've ever seen, which showed less freshwater influence. And then a really weird event that I'm going to shift over to Mike, where we thought the Department of Marine Resources had put out a notice that they were starting to see these like reddish brown algal blooms, and they asked us all to keep an eye out. And Mike and I were heading toward the Royal River to collect data, and we thought we were in the middle of one of those blooms, and we're like, wow, this is a really huge bloom. And I'm going to turn it over to Mike to tell you what it actually was and what the data told us about the observations we were seeing.
Sure, thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us. Like the rest of us, Casco Bay had a very unusual 2020.
Mike, I
And
don't want to interrupt you, but she's
Sure.
left us with a cliffhanger here about
I know, I'll
that
jump right.
bloom. And I mean, we can't let go of that.
We'll get
Sorry
right,
to
yes.
interrupt, yeah.
Sure. Well, we'll talk about the salinity, I guess. It was everyone who had a garden this year knows that it was a very, very dry summer. And those dry conditions on land were mirrored in the bay. Without a lot of fresh water getting into the bay, salinity levels in the bay were very high. And that's what we saw for most of the summer. But when we had the really intense rainstorms like we did in early July, it brought a lot of fresh water all at once. And that created that discoloration. We're at the mouth of the Royal for that event. And it really was alarming. We really were thinking we were in the middle of a large algal bloom, the discoloration of the water. And
It was
once we
sediment.
got there,
It was until the moment that Mike dropped the sonde in the water. Like I'd put the bucket in to collect water to for nitrogen sampling, and then Mike put the sonde in. And Mike, what happened when you put the sonde in?
Sure. We again, we expect salinities, a measure of how salty the water is, somewhere around 25 to 30 there. Salinity was only about 12 at that point. So you could see the influence of the fresh water on the bay at the mouth of that river. You could see the suspended sediment in the water that was discoloring the water. And we actually ran a transect, a line away from the mouth of the Royal, and kept checking the salinity with the data sonde to see when we'd see saltier water. And it was still 12 and 15 parts per thousand, a couple of miles out until we got back to 28 parts per thousand, back to what we'd expect for a coastal system.
Well, I want us to come back to this impact of salinity and fresh water and the drought in a little bit. And I may frame some of our conversation. We've heard Ivy, we've talked about data, we've heard Ivy talk about observations, and I can see in the chat, there are going to be all kinds of speculations and connections that come up. And I think it's always important for us to remember that our data means nothing without a context. But our data is very solid. We have very rigorous science behind it. Mike's one of the best people literally in the world at calibrating the equipment that we use. But then we have observations which are equally important, but not as defendable sometimes. And then we get into really squishy, but absolutely essential territory, which is, what does all this mean? What is the Bay telling us? Can we connect causes and effects? And I was saying to you earlier, you know, we have this idea that there's a cause and then there's an effect, but the actual experience is we see the effect And then as scientists, we're backfilling what was the cause, and we actually experience them in reverse. So it makes it very important in our line of work, communicating about science as we do, to remind all of us, audience and us alike, this difference between the observations and the data itself and what we're conjuring up about that. But I want to pivot now, Mike, and have you share with us the data. And as we move into this, I want to just frame this a little bit. Many of you are aware that 5 years ago, we dropped a data sonde into the water. You heard Ivy mention sonde a minute ago. It's a piece of equipment with a lot of sensors in it. Mike put together a cage of science with equipment in it. He's going to show you where he put that. And that's been collecting data for us hourly. That's been a fundamental game changer for us. And we are in the middle right now of wrapping up, we hope soon, a $1.5 million capital campaign to fund putting 2 more of those stations in the water and fund our community outreach work and Ivy's advocacy work around climate change for the next decade. And so having 5 years of work with this data sonde to get the data that we're getting, as well as a partial carbon dioxide sensor, has been a real game changer for us. And Mike, I know that's not the only sampling that we do. I'm going to let you talk about that, but let's pivot to the science here for a minute.
Sure.
May I add
Go
one
ahead.
little thing just before Mike does that, Kathy?
Yeah.
While you were talking, the thing that really struck me that we say all the time in the office and when we're in the field is that Casco Bay is changing. It's changing fast, and we're just beginning to monitor parameters that are helping us understand that change more. And while you were talking, I know I'm not supposed to be monitoring the chat, but a lot of things were popping up, and it was people saying, was the lower salinity due to this? How do you measure it? What are you doing? And I just want to let our members know that's what it's like to be in the field with Mike and me. We spend our entire time, whether we're driving around by truck or on the boat, going, what are you seeing? What am I seeing? Blah, blah, blah. What should we do about it? Who should we talk to? And so it's really great to see your questions in there. And I know a lot of them were about how do we measure salinity and what are we doing? And this is a perfect time to pivot to Mike, but I just have to say that to shift over to you, Mike. Go on.
Sure. And I will start by orienting everyone here. I'm going to share a map of the bay, hopefully. Here we are. Just very, very briefly, just to go into how and where we monitor water quality. We do this through 2 programs, basically. All of the blue dots, both the light blue and dark blue dots on this map of Casco Bay, are where we go out seasonally and collect data with that multi-parameter instrument, that data sonde. And we also collect samples for nutrient analysis while we're out there. Every few weeks, April through October, both by truck and by boat. And it was a very challenging season, as you've heard, logistically, but we did make it happen. Work did continue with the seasonal work. The green star right in the middle, right above Shabiga Island there off Cousins, is our first continuous monitoring station. This is the 2nd program for collecting water quality data. That's the Cage of Science that Kathy mentioned. Hourly data with a sonde and a carbon dioxide sensor. This was year 5 now for that. And I want to talk about some of the data first that we're seeing from that station, from that sonde. And actually, I'll jump right to the next slide, as long as I have your attention. I want to talk about temperature data from that Cage of Science. And I want to talk about the amount of phytoplankton we're seeing by using that continuous monitoring station, that Cage of Science. The graph you're looking at here shows water temperature. And this is one of the big takeaways. It was a very unusual year in Casco Bay. And this is one of the ways it was unusual. We have months, January through December, across the bottom of the graph. And this is water temperature again, both in Celsius on your left, Fahrenheit on your right, if you can't do that conversion in your head. Each colored line is a different year. And the thicker purple line is 2020, this year. And you can see that we started warm back in the winter. Looking at the left side of this graph, we had a very warm winter, warm January and February. And that purple line continues to be sort of on top of the other lines. It was much warmer than previous years. That continued right through the summer. And we noticed this, getting out in the boat, collecting samples, especially those early season samples. Usually you feel how cold the water is, and this year not so much. But anyway, the warmer water was certainly one of the takeaways.
Mike, too, it was like, it was surprising, even in Broad Sound, even early in the season, I didn't need gloves doing the water sampling, and
Exactly.
that's unusual. And then the readings we got in the upper New Meadows were wild. And that's not shown on this graph. Like, this is the data from the continuous monitoring station, but
Correct.
I mean,
Like,
we
what
had
do you mean when you say New Meadows, what are we talking about for temperature, high temperature?
around 80.
Yeah, we were close to
Seriously?
80 degrees Fahrenheit in the upper New Meadows. Just really, really high water temperatures.
That just sounds wrong in every way, doesn't it? This is
really
supposed to
does.
Maine. This
Well,
seems
there's a company that grows oyster seed and clam seed out there, and
Yep.
we talk to them every year. They always come over and chat with us about what we're monitoring. They tell us what they're seeing, and when they saw how high the water temperature was and how the dissolved oxygen levels were going down, they're like, okay, we may want to make a decision to pull our seed soon. And they left within 1 or 2 weeks of that.
And they grew so fast. With, I don't know if it was those temperatures or the amount of nutrients in the water, but they got very big very quickly, those oysters.
well, there's a request in the chat. When you do mention places like Broad Sound, can you clarify where is it Broad Sound, Cumberland, or Broad Cove, or people are asking for a little more specificity there?
Jump back to the map.
Yeah.
Right in the very middle is our Broad Sound site.
Yeah.
It's a deeper water site. It's more or less our reference station, more offshore water passes through there. I did want to note, now that we're back on this map briefly, that a lot of these sites are historical sites, those light and dark blue dots. We continue to add to an almost 30-year data set that was started by staff and volunteer citizen stewards a long time ago. And we continue every year to build on that data set.
Well, this
Mike,
is what
I'm sorry. I just thought we could show where New Meadows was too, where we got
And
the
New
high
Meadows. Yep. This is the upper New Meadows site, the upper right-hand corner. I hope everyone can see the cursor. But the upper right-hand corner of this map is the upper New Meadows, that dark blue dot there.
Yeah, well, that historical site data set of these historical sites, and you've picked out over the years a representation of sites that we continue to do that spot checking on through the season. And I know you and Ivy had shared with us through the summer the challenge of that, because some of the magic of what happens organizationally is that we have an intense advocate and an intense scientist spending time together in the field, exchanging all kinds of information and ideas, and speculating about a lot of things and exploring plans. And you weren't able to do that when you're doing these things with the truck. You couldn't do truck time together, and we had good protocols in place, and I commend you both for the incredible way you were able to continue field work and observe these good protocols. But that makes it for a really different season for the both of you as well, right?
It really did.
Yeah.
As important as the data is from that seasonal work, the time we get both to spend together and to be out seeing and seeing others, talking to other people out in the field. Ivy mentioned the oyster farm in the Upper New Meadows. It was few and far between. It was very quiet out there early on.
Well, I'm mindful of the time going by. Can we move on to the phytoplankton? I think that's really fascinating data that you could walk us through.
Sure, we measure, this is data.
Monitoring station data, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say, this is from that Cage of Science, the hourly, year-round data we collect. We look at chlorophyll fluorescence to give us some idea of the amount of phytoplankton in the water. Those are the single-celled algae, that's the base of the food web. And generally what we'd expect, again, this is the same kind of graph chart with January through December, months across the bottom. So we're moving through time left to right. Each colored line is a different year, with that thicker purple colored line being 2020, that very unusual year we're trying to get through. And what we'd expect is a fairly quiet winter followed by a fairly pronounced bloom of phytoplankton in the spring. This kicks off the productivity in the bay for the year, followed by moderate amounts of chlorophyll of phytoplankton, and then maybe a smaller moderate fall bloom. What we saw, and I'm going to take your attention to the green line of 2019 all the way back to last December, where we normally see very little amounts of phytoplankton in the water, as you can see in previous years. December showed a very large bloom of phytoplankton. So when we're usually quiet as far as these blooms of algae, we had a very large bloom. That bloom died off. Now we're on the purple line in January, but we came back with a second bloom in February, which died off, and then a third very large bloom through March and April, followed by a fourth bloom in May. So just a very busy, very productive, again, very unusual season. Lots and lots of phytoplankton early. What was really interesting was when these blooms did die off, like these periods where there's almost no phytoplankton in the water, June and then October, those times we were out and we had incredible water clarity, like Ivy mentioned, and it was extraordinary water clarity that I hadn't experienced before. And that was when we had these very low amounts of phytoplankton in the water.
So this is
I'm sorry, there were places where we saw to the bottom, and I hardly ever know visible to the bottom. It's like,
it seems like every mariner we had any contact with was telling us the same thing. And so this is where we get into the speculation part. We were having incredible droughts that were not bringing a lot of runoff right into the bay. And we had these intense phytoplankton blooms early in the season. You think there was just no sediment, no nutrients? The nutrients had been all used up and nothing new was coming in unless we have a rainstorm? Or what do you think?
We don't. Go ahead, Mike. You go first.
I was going to say that's generally speaking, yes. We very little phytoplankton at the end as a bloom crashes, and lack of suspended sediment in the water from the lack of runoff. Certainly made the water much clearer than usual.
What's incredible is when you look at the data set stacked like that, and I think Fred in the chat has pointed this out, and we've talked about this before. If you look at those intense spring blooms, a couple of years running in 2019, it bottomed out at the same time. And we were asking then, a year ago spring, that'd be a year and a half ago now, what's happening? There was no phytoplankton bloom. And we heard that across the Gulf of Maine. There was no bloom across the Gulf of Maine in 2019. And we heard the same thing about temperature this year. Across the Gulf of Maine, the temperatures were at an all-time high, in fact, in the whole eastern seaboard. So certainly Casco Bay is reflecting change that seems to be happening throughout this whole part of the ocean system, but intensely so here, right?
I think also, when you asked Kathy, was it less runoff, less nitrogen loading? We don't have our nitrogen data back yet, but one of the things that was really helpful this summer was to have so many water reporters out on around the bay.
What's a water reporter? What's a water reporter?
So for those of you who are water reporters, thank you. And water reporters are volunteer citizen scientists who help us gather observational data. And one of the, they use an app. There's instructions on our webpage. Sarah Lyman's always available to help, but they use an app to track conditions around the bay. And some of our water reporters just record things when they're out and about, and others have volunteered to take on a particular site and track it over the season. So part of your question, it was interesting to us because there were long periods of drought and then some intense rainstorms. And so that event that Mike was describing at the Royal River, where we thought we were in the middle of a bloom, which would make sense after a rainstorm, and it turned out to be just a huge transect of freshwater plume coming in. At that same time, there were other areas where there were large and intense nitrogen loads into Casco Bay, and our water reporters captured those. And two that really stand out in my memory are Pleasandale Cove in South Portland, which is behind Sea Dog Brewing. When you go over the $1 Million Bridge and turn right, it's that cove that's right down in there. And there were people reporting like chunks of almost bioluminescent green floating in the bay there, and you can see it in the photo to the left. That's part of what the bloom looked like at Pleasandale Cove. And the other place was at the Muir Point boat launch. There was a really significant bloom there that really took off after that mid-July rainstorm. So it was interesting, Kathy. I mean,
I like these two photos together because on the right, there's this beautiful, incredibly healthy eelgrass from Jewel Island, which is, you know, something else that seems to be making a comeback in parts of the Bay, right? And this is one of the really nursery areas. It's like the bad green on the left and the wonderful idyllic green on the right. It's a hoot.
well, you know, that photo on the right is one of my favorite photos of the summer, and it's like an aspirational goal. I want like every eelgrass bed in Casco Bay to look like that. It's just so beautiful and healthy.
Yeah. Well, Mike, you've got another thing you could share on your screen, I think, was we keep talking about the high salinity levels, and then we would have a rain event. And yes, could you walk people through this? This is a picture with 1,000 words.
Sure. The blue line, this is this past summer, June, and a little bit into July. The blue line is the amount of water coming out of the Royal River as measured in a river gauge there. It's not our equipment, but very, very great information. And it's wonderful that they have it. But you can see how low the water levels are in the Royal River. We had a big rain event. The amount of water coming out of that river spikes up. The red line represents salinity at that cage of science. And you can see how we were up here above 30.5 for salinity until the large freshwater inflow came in out of the Royal River. Our salinity dropped. And then as the storm ended and the river water started to subside, our salinity started to come back. But you can really see that pronounced effect of having a lot of fresh water all at once after a long period of drought and what that can do. And this is just before we saw that a lot of turbidity, a lot of suspended sediment off the mouth of the Royal.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because it brings us to the topic of stormwater. And stormwater is a phenomenon that we've been looking at for decades now, as many people in our audience know. And we labeled it one of the primary sources of pollution to Casco Bay a long time ago. We've been working intensively with municipalities to help them reduce stormwater runoff, as well as homeowners and various landowners. But because of the shifts that we're seeing, I mean, we've been talking about how the Bay is changing and changing quickly. The climate is changing and the weather is changing quickly, right? And so we are having these, like this year, periods of drought and then intense rainstorms where the stormwater runoff now is loaded with potentially a lot more erosion materials because of the sheer volume and the dryness of everything. And that makes its way down to the Bay. Eventually, those nutrients are important to the Bay, but it can also overload. We've seen in rainy years where we've had a lot more harmful and nuisance algal blooms than we have this year. But this stormwater piece is critical. And we know with adding 2 more monitoring stations, one of which will be over in the eastern side of the Bay, we expect we will see a huge pulse from the Kennebec River when there are big stormwater or melt events, right, that go on over there. But this is where our science and our observations dovetail and integrate completely with our advocacy work. And Ivy, I want to pivot now to some of that advocacy work. You have been a key player on the Coastal and Marine Working Group of the Maine Climate Council. And you've been working on stormwater issues for a long time. I don't know what you want to say about stormwater, but the observations that we get and the data we get really are the underpinnings of your work in the regulatory environment, which is where we really start to push behavior, push ordinances, and push laws. What do you want to tell us about that in this summer and where we're headed with some of that?
Sure. So I'm going to give an overview because I know we're getting near the question time, and I know there's a lot of great questions in the chat. So, you know, the law needs to evolve. And so instead of looking backwards and just reactively applying law to facts in the past, what Maine really needs to do, what the nation needs to do, what the world needs to do is project forward and look at the best science and the modeling that looks at sea level rise, increased and changed storm intensities and weather patterns, and make the law consider those projections in terms of its planning. And so you mentioned the Maine Climate Council. I know that there are other people on this call who are very involved in the Climate Council, and it is such a privilege to be part of that whole process. It's just an amazing, intelligent, dedicated, thoughtful, creative, and collaborative group of people working together. And I think in terms of regulatory, where we want to go, it is to really see that Maine revises all of its shoreland laws, whether it's coastal zoning, it's the stormwater law, Chapter 500, to really consider nutrient loading and the impacts of climate change, so that we are poised to apply the law in the correct way. And I know the municipalities will be doing some of that work too, through their new permit that regulates the municipal stormwater systems. But really, there's a lot of leadership that needs to come at the state level. So we'll really be looking to continue that work with the state, to support that work and to deepen it. And Kathy, I know we're running out of time, but just 2 ways that we are deepening it is that I have begun working with 22 water keepers around the country who are in the same place. I mean, this is cutting edge stuff. There isn't like we can go to other places and have a model. And we're all collaboratively looking at how do we advance the law in the coastal zone to address climate change and help improve and protect water quality. And then we're also working with students from the law school to get them immersed in the research and help us out with this effort.
Well, it's really terrific. And I want to underscore what you said about there's no model for this. And I want to embrace the scientific work that we're doing as well. There has been no model for this. And I want to remind us that it's not as though somebody walked in the door of our office and said, here's what you do and here's how you do it. We work very collaboratively inside the building as well as outside. And Mike, it took us some years to pivot. We, as you said earlier, we stand on the shoulders of 25 years of work, collective work, to do the work that we're doing now, which is the spot seasonal monitoring and this continuous monitoring station work to bring this underpinning of science to our work. But I really want to commend you for your vision in putting together the components of this monitoring station and really working on the redesign of that. The first monies that we got for the Climate Change in Casco Bay Fund, we put to work upgrading state-of-the-art equipment in that station. And as we prepare, as we start to complete this campaign, we're getting ready to put those 2 more stations in. And this is a game changer for us scientifically. And it's changing the whole level of the tone and tenor of the conversations that we're able to have about climate change with the community, because we're seeing the change. You can see it. If I encourage any of you who are with us today to remember, if you go to cascobay.org, all of our data are there. They're updated every 2 weeks or whenever there are new data sets. And you can cruise through those data sets yourself and really look at those data sets and say, well, what do I think Casco Bay is telling us? And you can have your own conversations about that. We know we have everything from 5th grade teachers to other scientists and government people accessing those data sets and looking at those. And so we're looking forward to being able to complete the campaign. And for those of you who have already contributed, thank you so much. I mean, we are using those funds, and I think doing some of the best integrated work we've ever done. And for those of you who haven't donated yet, you want to be on that list. This is a fund that we'll use for the next 10 years. There's a clear plan. It's all on our website. You probably received emails as well as snail mail from us about that. But I really want to encourage you as we wind down through the end of the year, join us, partner with us on that. You will be so satisfied that you did. I'm sure of that. So Will, I see that you've joined us. We're gonna pivot again. And now I hope you've identified questions for Mike and Ivy in the chat for us.
We have dozens of questions. I don't think we'll be able to get to them all. So I'm going to ask 2 right off the bat. One to Mike.
Yep.
What does a bloom? We've talked a lot about algae blooms. during this. What does a bloom look like? So I'm going to ask that to you. And then when Mike's finished, Ivy, the question I have for you is if you could talk a little bit about that Presumpscot slide in the Presumpscot River.
Yep. Well, sure. We always have some phytoplankton in Casco Bay. We were in a very productive area. A bloom is when you have an explosive growth of the phytoplankton. There's many, many, many more there than usual. And typically you can't see it by looking at it. You need to look at the data in our station, for example. There are certain toxic species of phytoplankton that you can pick up that do change the water color visually, but most of the blooms, most of the diatoms that we're looking at, is just a lot more of them than usual.
Yeah, I think we notice it's usually harder to filter when there's a bloom than
Yes.
and I'm trying to filter the samples to get dissolved inorganic nitrogen. It's harder to filter.
Right.
And
They show
it
up on
seems
the
like,
filter.
yeah, it seems like when we see discoloration, it tends to be blooms that are reddish and brownish in color. And sometimes they have a toxic species in them and sometimes they don't.
Right.
But I think that's my observation. That you've been out on the water for more years
Yep.
than me. Does that sound right?
Yep. That's right.
So Ivy, what about that Presumpscot slide?
So, well, if anyone from Portland Water District is on, a big thank you goes to you all for the restoration work you've done. But the slide occurred. We were concerned about it because it has potential to influence Casco Bay, as any sediment and whatever is in the sediment is delivered from the river into the bay. And we have been in regular communication with the Department of Environmental Protection, the groups who are concerned with the Presumpscot River and work to monitor and protect the health of that, and with the Portland Water District. And the upshot of what I have learned is that there's not a concern about toxic sediment going into the bay. A lot of the debris that went into the river, the water district removed a lot of debris that was still on land and put mulch down and riprap up to keep further sediment from getting into the river. And then they were doing some cleanup with divers in the water to be able to protect the infrastructure that they use for stormwater. So they were doing that work. Angela Brewer, who I believe is on this call from the Department of Environmental Protection, began monitoring the water quality going down the river. And she's still waiting and analyzing some of her data. And then we were out at the mouth of the river at a site that where we, if it was on that map, that where we normally monitor water quality. And I would say even a couple weeks ago, we still saw sediment, but it appears to have dissipated now. And I'm guessing that's in part thanks to the work that the Portland Water District did.
That's great. Will, what else have you got for us?
Yeah. So when do you expect to put in the 2 new continuous monitoring stations, where they're going, and how much money do we have left to raise out of the 1.5 million?
So exciting. I mean, 1.5 million is a lot, but when you're going to spend it over 10 years, it seems very modest. And we are down right now at about the $93,000. We are closing in on that 93,000, and we need everyone's help to do that. So give or give again. If you feel inspired, please support our work. It's very important. People support our work in lots of ways, but financially supporting us that way matters too. Mike, help me out with this. I think we're looking towards April 1st to get those in the water. If we can get them in the water sooner, we're going to do that. It's all about finishing this campaign. So This is all coming together within this next 6-month period of time.
Right.
We should be up and running with the other 2 stations. And as I say, it's not like we're not using the fund now. It is serving us incredibly well already, which is really good. One of the things that Mike did for us earlier this fall was make sure that when we're ready to order all the additional equipment, we wouldn't have long equipment delivery delays, because we've seen that in the appliance industry and other things. But I think we're going to be in good shape, and we're certainly thinking and planning ahead in that regard. So nice question.
So I just want to add something here, because I'm so excited about these 2 new stations. one will measure sort of the Portland Harbor influence on the bay, and the other will capture the Kennebec influence. So everyone who's put in the chat, like, it's all about stormwater and we need to know more, like, this is just going to, like, the first station, Mike selected a place that gave us like really good background conditions on the bay and where the water quality is like fairly consistent. And then we could compare it, contrast it with areas where we might see more problems. And I'm just so excited about what we're going to learn from these two new stations and how those
we expect
locations were
to be
selected.
very different. You know, they may all
Yep.
parallel each other, but we expect they're going to be quite different. And of course, that's speculation. We don't really know yet, do we? But they're very different regions of the bay. I think it helps us engage the communities in these different regions of the
Yep.
bay, right? Isn't that the first thing we do? Is we look at anything, we go to the map and go, that's my favorite place, or that's my house, or, you know, how's the water quality there? This place that I like to frequent. That's our nature. So I think it gives us at least good coverage for now, and it'll be fascinating. So get used to looking at our data sets now on the internet, because there'll be a lot more of them coming along before you know it.
And Mike, I know there still seems to be, I know there were stars on that chart, but it seems like there's been a lot of questions about exactly where they're going. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yep. Just as a reminder, the green star here off the back of Cousins is where we are now. But we are adding one over here at the Lower New Meadows, this yellow star right here, and then a third one down here in Portland Harbor. So all three stars will be cages of science within 6 months. Very exciting.
Very cool. So we have a lot of questions. I think we only have time for this one more. First, a Yarmouth resident and boater has noticed that there's not as many clams and crabs under the seaweed that they've been seeing. And a separate question kind of popped up that about the die-off of mussels and eelgrass that happened a number of years ago. Have we learned anything about what may have caused that? So kind of the seeing now less mussels and clams, as well as this historic question about 7 or 8 years ago when we lost a lot of eelgrass and mussels.
Mike, do you want to go first, and then I'll
No,
add
go right
anything?
ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Less than 2 minutes here.
Yeah. So Down East Institute that has done a lot of research in Casco Bay, and their studies indicate that there are still mussels in Casco Bay. It's just they're not in beds on the bottom anymore. They're hanging like under wharfs and piers and other places where they can be suspended. And they link it toward to green crab predation. And so that is what we've been told about that. And I know Angie Brewer is on the call and can probably talk more about the eelgrass situation, but I know that in some areas where there's excess, too much nitrogen entering the bay, we have unhealthy eelgrass beds from the excess nitrogen. But then there are other places where eelgrass beds have been harmed by green crab predation and also by boat moorings. And that those are sort of like 3 issues with eelgrass. That the mooring issue we're definitely working on, the nitrogen loading we're definitely working on, and others are working to try to create markets for green crabs, but that is a tough problem. Mike, did I leave anything out?
No, I will add though, anecdotally, for this year, I'm seeing fewer green crabs as well. One of the things I have to do with that cage of science is scrub it off every time I upload data. And there has been 3, 4, 5 green crabs in there that I have to shoo away. But this year, almost none. For whatever reason, I'm seeing fewer as well.
I saw a ton in Freeport on the mud
Did you?
flats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's going to be fascinating as we move into the late fall and the winter months to see what the continuous monitoring station tells us about what's going on in Casco Bay. And we'll be looking forward to checking those data sets regularly as they come up through the winter, see if we start seeing winter phytoplankton blooms or just what's going to be happening with temperature. Temperatures have already come down quite a bit. So it's fascinating. And I encourage you all to follow the story of the data as we move forward. Continue to participate in our online presentations. We've never done two that were even closely alike, so we really try to mix it up a lot. I again encourage you, while you can, to support the Climate Change in Casco Bay Fund. We want to thank those of you who do support our work financially, and those of you who support our work in terms of volunteering and the spiritual support that you give us. It's absolutely invaluable. We don't do this work alone. It's why we're called Friends of Casco Bay. And I thank you so much for joining us today. I think you could see the passion in these two staff members, and we all owe a debt of gratitude to you, Mike and Ivy, for your good work, and for this community for really caring about this special place. See you soon. Stay safe.
Thank you. Yeah.